Okay, guts?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then here we go. All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. Once more, it's another of our All Things Canada edition, and we welcome a new guest to the show, independent documentary filmmaker, Pitasanna Shanmugathas. Did I do that right?
Yeah, Pitasanna Shanmugathas.
Pitasanna Shanmugathas coming to us from Toronto, Canada, and he and his brilliant team bring our audience a superb 6-part docu-series called "Truth to the Powerless," which critically reveals the real truth and does much needed myth busting on Canada's foreign policy history, past and present. I would say it's the untold history of Canada's foreign policy, and I believe even it's the first of its kind, and it features brilliant interviews with past guests and even people who haven't been on the program yet, like Yves Engler, Tyler Shipley, Richard Sanders, Scott Taylor, Dimitri Lascaris, Professor Noam Chomsky, formerly of MIT, now Arizona, and others. He's our guest for the hour. So first off, Pitasanna, or Sir, thank you so much for joining me today, and and thank you also for reaching out so that we can do this interview.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Yuri. I've watched your program many times, and I'm very familiar with you, so I'm glad to be on. It's a privilege.
Like I said, it's a real honor to have you, especially because I think it was not more than a month ago I actually did see your 6-part documentary. Yes, actually, no, I saw it. I saw it back in August, and I was really impressed with it. Yves Engler had already been plugging and suggesting to people to check out this on the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour and on his articles at yvesengler.com. Saw the brilliance of, and then after I was done watching it, came the brilliant event that the CFPI did with you, Richard Sanders, who's been on the program, Tyler Shipley, one of our more recent guests, and and it's a brilliant documentary. It's the kind of documentary on Canada I've been waiting, to see, particularly on imperialism, and it very much was. It reminded me of those brilliant documentaries. Another indie Canadian documentary filmmaker, Scott Noble, has done, except he focuses mostly on American history and American imperialism and whatnot, whereas this documentary is a no holds bar. It is a myth busting documentary that does tell the truth about Canada doing all the crimes that we know that American Britain does, right?
That's right. I mean, this documentary, as you mentioned, it's really the first of its kind in the sense that we interview both the politicians that are responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy, advocating, championing Canada's foreign policy on a variety of issues like Afghanistan, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia. So we interview all these politicians, defense ministers, ambassadors, diplomats. And we also we interview the academics and activists who are seeking to challenge Canada's foreign policy. So we interview both the politicians and the academics, activists, those who are seeking a challenge. So we interview both those two groups of people, and this is like the first Canadian documentary that's actually interviewed both of them. There has been a documentary, like what really.
That's critical of like Canadian settler-colonialism, and sometimes corporate abuses, but nothing at all like this on Canadian imperialism, right?
Right. I mean, what gave me the idea to actually do a documentary like this in the first place was I'd stumbled on a documentary by a filmmaker by the name of Elaine Briere, and she did a documentary. In 1996, it was released in 1996. It was called "The Sellout of East Timor," and it it talked about Canada's role in supporting Indonesia while Indonesia had invaded and occupied East Timor, killed a quarter of the population, the worst atrocity post World War II. So that was like the first documentary a Canadian documentary that ever looked at Canada's foreign policy in a critical light. Previous programs that focus on Canadian politics, they would glorify Canada and whatever, be like by the CBC or like the National Film Board or whatever. They'd glorify Canada's foreign policy. This was the first documentary which I've ever seen, and I've like looked prior 1996, couldn't find a single one that actually looked at Canada's foreign policy critically. And so Elaine Breer's was the first one. And then I stumbled on another documentary by a filmmaker by the name of Amy Miller called Myths for Profit. And this was more broader in scope and kind of looked at elements of like militarism and neoliberalism. It was more broader in scope. But this was another documentary on Canadian foreign policy. But what I noticed in common between both documentaries by both filmmakers is that they only interviewed the activists and the academics challenging Canada's foreign policy. They didn't interview the politicians responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy. So that's when I first thought, hey, wouldn't it be a cool idea if somebody did a documentary that not only interviewed the activists and academics, but also interviewed the politicians? You get the establishment's perspective, and then you get another side that's challenging the establishment's perspective. So that's when the idea first came to my head. But it would be a little while later, a few years later, until we actually executed it. I had befriended a filmmaker by the name of Ryan Ellis, and we had formed a good relationship. And one day he just kind of asked me, I'm looking to like invest in like a documentary or something, and do you have something in mind that you want to do? And I told him, yeah, I have this idea kicking around about doing a documentary on Canadian foreign policy, but not just any kind of documentary, that we should also interview the politicians responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy. So he loved the idea, and I pitched this to him in April of 2019. So we worked on it for 3 years, even during the pandemic and everything. And what you have, the end result is what you have before you now. So
nice. And actually funny, and funny because you said that it was watching a documentary by Elaine Breer on East Timor, and actually funny enough, I was, when I started to get, more, deep into understanding, political philosophy and developing, various, left perspective. I think the first time I said, wow, this is what I want to do. I want to be a journalist. I want to be like, I want to be, teach history and stuff like that, was actually John Pilger's documentary "Death of a Nation" about East Timor, and that was I saw that in high school, and that was and of course John Pilger, an Australian journalist based in the Brits, and that was him going after not just America, but Britain's involvement in the mass slaughter of what Indonesia did in East Timor, and also really going after and like not letting Australia off the hook. And I thought to myself, wow, like who is this guy? And that's exactly the kind of like journalism I want to do. Like I really don't want to like just leave out other countries which are also complicit in the imperial world order, which is led by America and so forth. So that's interesting that the documentary you saw about Elaine Breer on Canada's involvement, which I only found out about, when I discovered the work of Yves Engler, and also found those documentaries, and of course Professor Chomsky, who you speak to, is also featured in those things, and I remember typing a positive positive comments about your film, and I was saying that that's great to finally see a documentary with Yves Engler, Dimitri Lascaris, Richard Sanders, and even Chomsky's contributions are fantastic, because the great professor is he's not talking about like what his country's doing. He's doing that brilliant myth busting he does, which is holding Canada into account. So yeah, your film really is brilliant. And that leads to my so that actually leads to my first question, which is when you went to school, not in university, but when you went to school, particularly in high school, before going into university, what year or period was this? And I ask this because I'd like to understand how Canada's history in the world is taught and packaged, and then rebranded to its population and those who come outside of Canada to study and work and live in Canada after they're done going to whatever McGill or Concordia and whatnot.
So I went to high school between 2010 and 2014. And when I went to high school, I remember we had history. You had the mandatory history class, but I remember history class in high school being very dry. The material was very dry. You kind of learned about Canada and World War II, but you didn't learn about how we talk about in our documentary how Mackenzie King supported Hitler. He was an anti-Semite. You don't learn about those kind of things. To the extent that Canadian history, to the extent it was actually critical of Canada, it was really only critical about Canada with respect to residential schools and what we did to the Indigenous people. There was some criticism there when I went to high school, but even that, it could have been more substantive. The criticism could have been way more substantive. But to the extent that we were ever critical about Canadian history, it was with respect to how we discussed Indigenous people and our treatment of them. But we didn't talk about, for instance, like in our documentary, we talk about how, with respect to Canada's support for apartheid South Africa, how Linda Friedman, the academic we interviewed, who did a phenomenal publication on Canada's relationship with South Africa, we interview her, and she talks about how white minority South African officials came to Canada. They looked at our residential schools and they said that, oh, wow, this is a model for how we can implement our apartheid system in South Africa. We didn't learn that in high school. They don't teach you that in high school. Even though Linda Friedman's work was already out there, you could, any historian, any person in history could access it. We weren't taught that. So it was very dry. It was very boring. I actually was not a fan of high school history. Like if you told me I would be like looking into Canada's history and Canada's foreign policy, as an adult, I would have thought you were crazy just because it was so dry, it was so boring. I had no interest in it. So, it was just, I guess it was because it was just so establishment line stuff that was just like so, boring to me.
And then that means, and then because Canada is often depicted as the good cousin of Britain and the nicer little brother to the U.S. and of course Canadian foreign policy just in general is not scrutinized in so much of the global press, whether it's the German press, French press, British press, and so forth. So then that means when when somebody comes to Canada and gets into the university level like you did, they're just going to get the same. Canada, we're a force for good in the world. Canada, we're nicer capitalists, unlike America, and is that how the propaganda gets recycled and reused then?
I think very much so. When I did my university studies at the University of Toronto. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, and then I did my graduate degree at the Monk School, which is the University of Toronto's Monk School. The Monk School was its main donor was Barrick Gold, who was the founder of. Its main donor is Peter Monk, who's the founder of Barrick Gold, and Barrick Gold is. For the longest time, it was the largest gold mining company in the world. It still remains one of the largest gold mining companies in the world. And Barrick Gold has committed horrendous atrocities in Latin America. Barrick Gold security forces have raped, civilians, have poisoned ecosystems, devastated villages. And Peter Monk, the founder of this gold mining company, was funding the Monk School. And I was a student and a graduate of the Monk School, so we would get guest lectures from politicians. You'd get the former Australian Prime Minister once came. Like now, Canadian members of Parliament come. And so it's a very establishment leading foreign policy school. And I remember, I was taking a course on Canadian foreign policy. and I wanted to talk about. We had to do a major essay for the course, and I want to talk about Canada's involvement in the Afghanistan war. And we had to do like an outline, a proposal for that. So for the proposal, you got to give out your arguments, what arguments you want to flesh out in the major essay. And one of the sub points I want to talk about is Canada's support for neoliberalism during the Afghanistan conflict. And the professor just said, "No, you're not talking about this." So so that to me was like, if you're a professor, you should be encouraging students to explore, think outside the box, critically challenge, explore all these different resources. But the most you could say about Canada's involvement in Afghanistan was that it was a mistake. You couldn't talk about how Canada's involvement. You couldn't compare Canada's involvement to the Soviet Union's involvement in Afghanistan, and how that was a disaster, and how we had just gone in there and we had completely devastated the country and just given rise to all these insurgents. You couldn't make that comparison. And my professor was a super NATO hawk. Just hated. I remember I actually made that comparison in my conclusion, and then he did not like that at all, and he actually initially gave me a lower grade, and I had to actually tell him, because I gave very compelling sources, arguments, citations, so I actually had to go back to him and say, can you justify this grade? I'm not asking you to increase it, just justify it. And he said, okay, I do realize I was a little harsh. Let me bump your grade up, and he did. But he was a very pro-NATO, just a hawk, but those are the kind of academics that were at the Monk School. The Bill Graham was a large figure who we actually interviewed in the documentary. He was a large figure in the Monk School, and he even lectured a course which I was in as well. So these are the kind of figures that are in the Monk School. So that's the kind of environment that I was around. I was involved with as a student. You could talk about Lester B. Pearson, but he's a peacekeeping figure. But you can't talk about how Lester B. Pearson was instrumental in the dispossession of Palestinians from their lands. He was instrumental in the creation of Israel. He was called Rabbi Pearson by Israel. You can't talk about how Lester B. Pearson supported the Vietnam War. You can't talk about any of those things. But in our documentary, we discussed that you can only really talk about Lester B. Pearson as a Canadian peacekeeper. He had introduced peacekeeping to the world. The Suez Crisis, he diplomatically solved that. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. But that's the image. But that was my experience, basically.
That's fascinating. And of course, I assume, when people do talk about when people in Canada do I assume, some who are, much better informed and do criticize, the Nobel Peace Prize because it was given to Henry Kissinger, or given someone like, or given to somebody like Milton Friedman in economics. But I'm sure when you say them, well, and Lester B. Pearson also should have his Nobel Prize, revoked, because there's the calls that, of Aung San Suu Kyi, that she should have her Nobel Prize taken away. But I'm sure if you were to mention Lester B. Pearson in that thing, people would go, what the beep are you talking about, dude? Like, Pearson was fantastic, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we significantly challenged this myth about Pearson being this peacekeeping figure. Noam Chomsky, we interviewed him, and he challenges this myth. We actually even include an excerpt of him on the CBC radio show in the first episode, where he's being interviewed by Peter Gagowski. I think I'm butchering his last name. But he was a morning CBC radio host, and Chomsky came in one day from from Lester B. Pearson Airport, and he challenges Chomsky about how Chomsky's been critical of Lester B. Pearson, but Chomsky's like, no, Pearson was a strong proponent, a strong advocate of the war. He even counseled Lyndon B. Johnson, the U.S. president, told him not to use nuclear weapons, but use, these iron bombs. You can use just bomb them, just use iron bombs, but stay away from nuclear weapons. That, that's his, that was Pearson's opposition, quote unquote, to the Vietnam War. Don't use nuclear weapons, but use anything else. And we do an excellent role of just exposing that and exposing Lester B. Pearson, the role that he played in creating Israel and dispossessing Palestinians. It was this initiative by Lester B. Pearson. The Jews, they did not even they constituted a fraction of the people in Palestine, yet they were given an overwhelming majority of the land, and that was just viewed as unjust. But Canada and these European colonialists were forcibly imposing that solution, and we go into that, we expose that a great deal.
It's unbelievable. It reminds me of when I first interviewed Yves Engler, and before we started the recording, I was asking him, how's the coverage in Canadian news during this federal election? How's the coverage of Canadian foreign policy been? He says, it's terrible. And then I was saying to him, it can't be that bad. It can't be worse than coverage of Indigenous affairs. And he was saying to me, oh no, Youri, like Canadian foreign policy is the worst covered topic in debates, in media, on television and so forth. And I was saying, really? Worse than worse than Indigenous affairs? And then when I actually saw, that ridiculous, prime minister's debate with Maxime Bernier, Elizabeth May, Yves-François Blanchet, foreign policy was the worst covered topic. So it's almost like I think Lenny Bruce once said that if white America told the truth for one day, its whole world would fall apart. Is that kind of why Canada is trying its very hard to keep a lid on its real role in the world? Because if you start talking about anti-black racism in Canada and of course settler colonialism, you got the large protests like what happened during the solidarity protests of George Floyd and the discovery of all of those unmarked graves in former residential schools, right?
I think a large part of why Canada's foreign policy isn't really given, especially during debates with these national leaders, isn't really given significant time, is that people just kind of dismiss Canada's foreign policy as us being puppets of the United States. So it's like, oh, Canada, yeah, they're just a puppet of the United States. They'll just do their, United States is their main ally. They'll just do what the United States says. That's it. But I think in this docu-series that we've done, we kind of show that Canada has its own foreign policy, which is worth looking at. And Canada sometimes does its own foreign policy actions independent of the United States. So, for example, we talked about mining earlier. Canada, as a leading, mining giant in the world, going into countries like Latin America and Africa and extracting these minerals, these resources, devastating these villages, poisoning these ecosystems. Canada is allowing its mining companies to do this because it's an extremely lucrative industry. The United States isn't telling Canada to do this. Canada is doing this out of its own free will, out of its own capitalistic desire. Another example is Canada selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which we even interview Canada's last ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Dennis Horak. We interview him, and Canada's selling these weapons to Saudi Arabia, which human rights reports, which we cite in the docuseries, they've said there is credible evidence it's being used in Yemen to kill civilians. And the reason why Canada is selling these weapons is because the weapons industry. It's a very lucrative industry, And the ambassador, when we ask him in the docuseries, what about these allegations that they're being used in Yemen, Canadian weapons being used in Yemen? He kind of says, "Oh, we do our best. We have a check system. We have a robust check system." But but at the end of the day, does Canada want a weapons industry or not? That's the question you have to ask. And because this weapons industry generates so many jobs, that's his line. And then we get Richard Sanders to counter that. And Richard Sanders says, actually, if you invest in infrastructure, invest in the public sector, you can generate more jobs. We even post statistics to support that. So that's like an example of where you have these two sides. Just you have both perspectives, and we do that with several different issues. But that's just going to the point again that Canada's doing this not because of the United States. Canada has its own independent foreign policy there. Now, even in the case of Canada's support for Israel-Palestine, Canada, we have our Jewish population. We have like less than 2% of as far as Jews in Canada. It's less than 2%. So our Jewish population is very, it's very small. But even we have an Israel lobby, but it's not that significant. But the reason why Canada supports Israel is because Canada and Israel, they share a fundamental relationship in the sense that they're both settler colonial nations. They've both been founded on suppressing, dispossessing its indigenous people. And so in that sense, they share that bond. That's why Canada supported South Africa. Apartheid South Africa, the same thing. The white South African state was founded on suppressing and brutalizing its indigenous population, its black indigenous population. Same thing here with Canada. So that has nothing. I mean, if Canada wanted to, it could actually take principled opposition and actually vote in favor of these UN General Assembly resolutions on Palestine, which over 100 countries support annually. If Canada wanted to, it could do that, and it wouldn't. The United States would not impose severe sanctions devastating our country. That would not happen because in the past, previous prime ministers have actually voted in favor of such resolutions, and it's only now that we've more and more increasingly with Stephen Harper and even a little bit before that, but especially with Stephen Harper, Canada began to be very pro-Israel, voting against resolutions which over 100 countries support annually. So if Canada wanted to, it could take these principled, independent positions. I mean, even on the issue of nuclear weapons, Justin Trudeau is a staunch opponent of supporting the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. He's a staunch opponent of any measure to eliminate nuclear weapons and to eliminate countries that have nuclear weapons. He's a staunch opponent of that. His father actually was a staunch advocate during the Cold War. In the UN, he made a speech saying that we need to eliminate nuclear weapons. They're an extreme danger. He was actually the complete opposite. But if Canada wanted to, it could take a principled opposition, principled role in calling for a world without nuclear weapons, and calling for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Canada could do that. This has nothing to do with the United States. It's just Canada just supports these imperial positions because that's just who we are.
Unbelievable, and just to just to add on to what you were saying about how about how Canada is kindred spirits with Israel. Canada is also a member of the deep state spying Five Eyes alliance, which is settler-colonial New Zealand, settler-colonial Australia, settler-colonial US, and Britain, who exported that model of settler colonialism in how they dealt with the Irish and minor Scottish and Welsh nationalism and so forth. And I always love the story that John Pilger shares when he talks about the apartheid Aboriginal people, Indigenous Australians suffer, and he goes and he says that when he would go to South Africa undercover for the Daily Mirror, he said that he would be greeted by liberals, white liberals in South Africa, and they would go, "Oh, you're from Australia, you're one of us, and Australia, you guys really know how to deal with your black people there, your indigenous people there." So that's interesting that South Africa also felt the exact same way about Canada, and I'm sure of course kindred spirits with the United States. But that leads to my second question, which is how did you come to think, wait, something is not right about what I'm being told about my country? And how did you sort of begin to decolonize your mind on Canada's real role in global affairs?
I was at the airport. I was waiting for a flight some years back, and I was scrolling through my phone. You know, when you're like just kind of killing time, scrolling through your phone, and I was scrolling through my social media feed, and I stumbled on this article uh, uh, by it was the title was something like the myth of Lester B. Pearson or something like that, and
Hmm.
it was by this writer by the name of Yves Engler,
Yeah.
and so I
Good, yeah,
clicked on the
good old
article.
Eve.
So
our,
I
our,
click
our
on the
frequent
article,
champion on the program.
and I click on the article, and I'm reading this article, and it's talking about how Lester B. Pearson, supported supported the Vietnam War. He played a role in dispossessing Palestinians in the creation of the state of Israel, and it was kind of like it just kind of blew my mind because I didn't really know, like, you think about Lester B. Pearson, you think peacekeeper, and that's really all I knew because that's really all I'd been taught. So when I read this, it was kind of like, wow. And then I wanted to know more about this writer Yves Engler, and then I then came across his book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, which was like a huge, like,
Brilliant
it
book,
just blew
yeah.
my mind open. Like, it just touched on everything. It was like a collective work. It was like an essential resource that anybody who wanted to know anything about Canada's foreign policy, if you want to, literature, it was like a definitive literature really on Canada's foreign policy. Just touched on Canada's support, for apartheid in South Africa, Israel, Palestine, mining companies, our horrendous record on climate change, our support for fascism in World War II, and just touched on so many different issues. And it just blew my mind open. That was really the first. Yves Engler's work was quite instrumental in just really allowing me to see, Canada through this imperial lens. And through Yves Engler, I came across, works of Richard Sanders and people like Justin Perdue and several other authors.
Fantastic, and those are also brilliant folks as well. I need to get Justin on the program in the future. And well, you've already explained to us, of course, what the film is about. But what were some of the hidden facts you learned that surprised you the most when learning about Canada's imperial history?
I think the role of finance in Canada's foreign policy, that's like a thread that's kind of just that just runs across Canada's foreign policy. But one of the things I found out was when we were interviewing Richard Sanders, which really surprised me, is that the role that Canada's pension plan, how the government invests our Canadian pension money into these horrendous, profit maximizing companies, like these tobacco companies, these mining companies, these oil companies, just the most horrendous. These arms companies, like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, just these horrendous companies that are involved in so many horrendous atrocities. And as Canadian citizens, as taxpayers, we're all complicit in this. Like, we're just automatically complicit in these horrendous atrocities, and we don't even know that we're complicit. Like that, like most Canadians wouldn't even know we actually.
Wait. Are you saying to me that evil did not start under Stephen Harper? Because that guy is the root of all evil, and then comes the white Obama, Justin Trudeau, not living up to Canada's good nature, right?
and I mean, this, we discussed this in the docu-series, but the way that the Canadian pension plan money, how is being invested in these horrendous companies, this actually began. Richard Sanders talked about this. This began during the Jean Chrétien government, where Paul Martin was the finance minister, and this is where Canada's pension money, which used to previously be invested in like building roads and bridges and public infrastructure and in the public sector, was taken. The pension money was taken from there and shifted significantly to investing in these horrendous profit maximizing private sector corporations that are just involved in the most egregious atrocities they can possibly think of. And that was done not during Stephen Harper, but during the Jean Chrétien government going onward.
And continuing with that, what are some of the big myths around Canada that you still find it's quite an epic struggle to overcome, even amongst the people who you come across who are fairly well informed and don't buy into the false thesis that Canada is a force for good in the world. Because like when you do, the kind of man on the street and ask, questions just to, anybody, on the street, it seems as if some people were thinking, yeah, I'm not really sure I buy into Canada being a force for good in the world. I think Canada is a force for good in the world, but we're next to the U.S., so the U.S. makes us do so the U.S. makes us do bad things. So yeah, so some of the topics he discovered. Why, what are some of the ones where even amongst the most well-informed people you come across, the best of the left, that you still are thinking, wow, we still have we still have our work cut out for us in decolonizing people's minds when it comes to Canadian imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, as you'd mentioned, in addition to interviewing politicians, academics, we also interview just regular Canadians, just everyday Canadians. We go on the street and we interview them, and some of the things they've told us is that they didn't. One person told us that they didn't even know that Canada was involved in the Afghanistan war. For instance, they didn't know about that. They didn't know about the Lima group. They didn't know, who Lester B. Pearson was even. Some people goes like, oh yeah, that's the airport, but that's as far as, I think a lot of people just kind of dismiss Canada's foreign policy just because we're so close to the United States. They're like, oh yeah, Canada just does whatever the United States does. But when you do that, you're not willing to actually look into the nuances of Canada's foreign policy and actually willing to see that it's actually way more complicated than that. Yes, the United States is our main ally. Yes, they do have significant influence. Pierre Trudeau once said, comparing Canada and the United States, Pierre Trudeau once said that the United States is like an elephant and Canada is like a mouse. Every time the elephant stomps, the mouse feels every reverberation, every twitch, and to a significant extent that's true. But once again, you have to look at the nuances and look at how Canada supported Indonesia in its invasion of East Timor, sold weapons, had mining interests in Indonesia, and Canada was willing to be silent during Indonesia's worst atrocities in East Timor, while Indonesia had killed a quarter of the population in East Timor. Relative population, that was the worst atrocity post-war in the post-World War II era. Canada was a silent bystander, and we see a parallel now with Canada's support for Saudi Arabia in its bombing of in its horrendous atrocities in Yemen.
You mentioned Indonesia and what they did to East Timor, but what Indonesia still continues to do to West Papua, which if I was involved in Black Lives Matter in Canada and other other Canadian anti-black racist policies abroad, like what Canada does in the continent of Africa and Latin America, West Papua, Canada continues to support Indonesia's genocide and colonization of West Papua.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is still ongoing, and now in the case of Yemen, it's the worst according to the United Nations, it's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So, and that is kind of like a parallel with the Canada's support for Indonesia and East Timor. It's not in terms of scale. The atrocities are completely it's not even, there's no comparison. What Indonesia did in East Timor is far worse. But it's kind of interesting to see the parallel in the sense that Justin Trudeau supports Saudi Arabia wholeheartedly. His father supported Indonesia wholeheartedly. So there's always these interesting parallels between Justin Trudeau and Pierre Trudeau, where it's like you look at these certain issues and it's kind of like history kind of rhymes. It doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes, and it's interesting to see that. But Canadians aren't willing to look at these nuances, and the main reason for that is because they're not exposed to these nuances. The Canadian media, which we talk about in our docu-series, they don't really criticize. Paul Jay, for instance, who had a show on the CBC, we interviewed him. he doesn't talk. He mentions how Canadian journalists, they don't really discuss these the horrendous atrocities that Canada's still part of. How Canada's trying to overthrow a democratic government in Venezuela as part of the Lima Group, which we talk about in our docu-series as well, which Paul J talks about. The Canadian media, they don't really discuss this. They're not willing to discuss this because they serve the interests of the government. Paul J, he goes about this extensively, having been an employee of the CBC, having a show on the CBC. He talks about how Canada is very much involved. The Canadian Prime Minister is very much involved in who heads the CBC, who's in charge of the CBC, and the Canadian Prime Minister is going to appoint somebody who reflects, who protects the Canadian government's interests, who stands cover for Canada, selling weapons to these horrendous human rights abusers, who supports Canada's atrocity and its mining atrocities, who won't criticize Canada for any of that. So in that sense, the reason why the Canadian public, they're not really aware of these atrocities is, for one reason, they kind of just dismiss Canada as just being a puppet of the U.S., so it doesn't really matter. But a second reason, and the more important reason, is the Canadian media is not willing to talk about this, so they don't really have a source of education. So, the reason why we've put out this docuseries for free is so that, people who are genuinely curious about Canada's foreign policy, they're like, oh, I've just heard, I'm not really sure about Canada. I think we're doing some bad stuff. I don't know what. Like, they can go and watch this docuseries, truthtothepowerless.com, for free. We're putting it all out for free, and they can go watch it, and they can become educated on these major issues which Canada's, the Canadian government, really since the post-World War II era has been involved in.
That is a perfect segue then to this question, which is, how important is Canada hiding behind peacekeeping, whether it's UN peacekeeping, membership of NATO, or Canada's nonprofit NGO profit industrial complex? And from there, talk about how Canadian peacekeeping was marketed with Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. Both of those wars and NATO's involvement are branded as the good wars. Those are the wars where a leftist and where an anti-war leftist says, I may not support Canada in Iraq, but I do support Canada in what we did in Yugoslavia, what we did in Afghanistan, what we're doing in Ukraine. And so talk about that, and then from there also talk about the total lack of opposition to Canada's destruction of democracy in Haiti in the early 20s.
Yeah, I mean, Canada.
Wait. Early 2000s. Early 2000s. We were supporting fascism though in the 1920s, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Canada kind of has this ability, because we have this global image as a peacekeeping nation, an unjust global image, but nevertheless it's there. Canada is able to go into these different countries and commit these horrendous atrocities in the name of this peacekeeping image, and the world kind of just accepts that. So in the case of Canada's involvement in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, it was kind of NATO. After the end of the Cold War, they were searching for a purpose. What do we do with NATO? And then came along this atrocity in Yugoslavia, where Milosevic was branded as this horrendous dictator who was just slaughtering the Albanians. He was, and so that's the establishment line. So we interview politicians. We interview Canada's former ambassador to Yugoslavia, James Bissett. We interview Louis Mackenzie, the Canadian Major General. We interview Michael Kurgan, who was the foreign policy advisor to Jean Chrétien, who was the Canadian Prime Minister that was responsible for our involvement in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. We interview the whole host of academics as well as politicians, and the reason why Noam Chomsky even discusses this. The reason why Milosevic had to go is because Milosevic would not acquiesce to the neoliberal post-Cold War order. Noam Chomsky, exposes how Milosevic was the last holdout in Europe to this neoliberal order, which Washington, having been the victor of the Cold War, was trying to implement. So Milosevic had to go, and there were atrocities certainly between the Serbians and the Albanians, but it was completely blown up, and there was an image.
So Canada did a lot of the most difficult propaganda to always push back against is what I call half truths. So did Saddam Hussein use weapons of mass destruction? He did, but they were given to him by America, Germany, France, Britain, Canada, and so forth. Did he use it on did he use it on Kurdish rebels? Yes, he did use it. Did he have weapons of mass destruction by the time George W. Bush wanted to invade Iraq? No, he didn't. Is Putin, a fiscally conservative, socially conservative, politician? Yes, he is. But but is Alex Navalny really, a good person? And are we really supporting good people in Ukraine when when the EU and Canada and so forth supported people who are lionizing Stefan Bandera and Nazi collaborators and so forth, and even those expat groups, those Eastern European expat groups, which were founded by runaway Nazi war criminals and so forth. And then, of course, that's where the problem of half-truths come about. And so what were some of the half-truths when they came to the dismemberment of Yugoslavia and the eventual ouster of Slobodan Milosevic?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly, there were atrocities, being committed by Milosevic, Albanians and Serbian, between Serbians and Albanians, but it was completely. There was a fabrication that was done. Was a white flag incident claiming that Milosevic had, killed these scores of Albanians, when it turned out not to be true. The Ratchek massacre, I believe it's called, and it kind of gave this pretense as well for NATO to say, these leaders in NATO, the United States, saying, to say, hey, look what's going on here. We got to intervene. This is our mission. This is our mission as an alliance, NATO alliance. But they didn't have a UN Security Council authorization to intervene. So, the United States, Canada, all these countries said this is a humanitarian mission. These Albanians are being slaughtered. Milosevic is a dictator. We got to go, and we got to go, bomb. We got to go bomb the country. We got to go, force Milosevic to surrender. And that was the image. That was the narrative that was put forth. But James Bissett, he says in the docu-series that the bombing actually exacerbated the conflict. James Bissett, the Canadian ambassador to Yugoslavia, says the bombing exacerbated the conflict. And if the pretense is that this is a humanitarian mission, James Bissett says, how are you going to have a humanitarian mission by bombing? Bombing bridges, bombing, the news stations. These are horrendous human rights atrocities, which now we see the Canadian media, the U.S. media, Western media, they're attacking Putin for what he's doing in Ukraine. Horrendous. But we did similar things and worse in Yugoslavia under NATO. So it's and even more horrendous things in Iraq, which Canada actually supported, and we discussed this. Canada supported the second war in Iraq. Canada played a role in the first war in Iraq, but we provided covert support to the second war in Iraq. We provided weapons to the United States. Canadian Major Generals Richard Sanders discusses this. We interview the defense. The defense minister David Pratt. We interview Bill Graham, and they all kind of give this narrative. We interview Michael Kurgan, Canada's ambassador to the United States, and they all kind of give this narrative of oh yeah, Canada, we were opposed to the war in Iraq, and we did the principal thing, and we couldn't go, we didn't have a UN Security Council authorization. That was the reason Jean Chrétien gave for why we couldn't go in Iraq. But secretly, we were supporting the United States, in their horrendous atrocities in Iraq. having overthrown Saddam Hussein. So that's just, but in that sense, Canada, we want to promote this image of us being a peacekeeping nation. We're benevolent. We don't want to get involved in this war, but secretly, covertly providing all forms of quiet support. In the case of Afghanistan, we interview Bill Graham extensively on Afghanistan as well, and we interview a Canadian soldier as well who was fighting in Operation Kandahar, which was Canada's real first significant mission, combat mission in Afghanistan under NATO, and we interview the politicians to get the establishment line, but we also expose how Canada was committing these horrendous atrocities in Afghanistan, how Canada's actions led to the large mass refugees. It actually strengthened the Taliban even more. Noam Chomsky, we interviewed him as well in that episode, and he talks about how what Canada should have done is what the United States should have done, the West should have done, is listen to the moderates like Abdul Haq, who was a moderate, who said that by engaging in this NATO bombing of Afghanistan, you're actually empowering the Taliban. We're trying to get rid of the Taliban on our own, and you're actually strengthening the Taliban because you're committing this horrendous atrocities against these civilians. You're radicalizing these civilians, and you're doing it, in the name of trying to get Osama bin Laden. That's the pretext. But when we interviewed Justin Prodor, he talks about how Pakistan had facilitated the exit of the main leadership of the Taliban and all these bigwigs, who the United States is claiming that we want to capture. Their exit was facilitated by Pakistan. So why are we even in Afghanistan in the first place? This notion that we're in Afghanistan to liberate women and to free them. That's what Bill Graham was telling me when I was interviewing him. We're liberating the women, and even Lewis Mackenzie was saying we had a great strategy, a 3D policy, defense, diplomacy. We had this 3D policy of negotiation, defense, diplomacy, but he was even praising that. So, but in reality, we were just it was all a pretense for these horrendous atrocities that we were committing, and we see now, with the West, with the United States having withdrawn from Afghanistan, Canada having withdrawn several years earlier in 2014, 2013, we see how Afghanistan is in such a dismal state, really, and the Taliban is committing horrendous atrocities, and we empowered the Taliban by invading Afghanistan. A solution to the Afghanistan.
Exactly. Back in the 80s, and back in the 80s.
And Noam Chomsky says a simple solution to if we want to get bin Laden for what he did in Afghanistan, the Taliban was actually making offers to the United States that we will extradite bin Laden, provided that you give us evidence. That's what the Taliban was telling the Bush administration, and we actually show these articles from the Washington Post at the time that the U.S. rejected such offers. So a simple solution would have been just give the Taliban concrete evidence that bin Laden was responsible for 9/11, and then call the Taliban out on this, or conduct a police operation. And that's what you do when you have an offender. So that's Afghanistan, just a horrendous mess. We had this flowery intentions. We're going to liberate women. We're going to liberate the country, democracy, and also we're going to get bin Laden. None of that came to pass. Bin Laden was found in Pakistan, but that's a whole other issue. In the case of Haiti, we devote episode 6. We interview all the major players. We interviewed the
which sorry to interrupt, but I have to say, I think of all of the imperial crimes, past and present, that really just gets me mad that I even have to watch something just to cool off. Canada and Haiti, France and Haiti, and all the other European countries, and even Latin American, African countries who all participate in bullying Haiti. That one, really just makes my blood boil the much. But continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, when we were interviewing the politicians that we interviewed for this docu-series, we didn't challenge the politicians. Actually, when we were interviewing them, we wanted to get the establishment line, so we were asking them just to give their opinions on whatever foreign policy issue we were talking about. The only exception that we made as far as challenging a politician, the only exception was Bill Graham. That's the only politician that I challenged when I interviewed them. Reason being is we were trying to get an interview with Bill Graham for like a year and a half, and just a lot of back and forth with his office. He was in ill health. He had to go for surgeries, and he was getting old in age. And I knew that he was going to die fairly soon, and I knew that he had a significant role to have played in Haiti, having been, the foreign affairs minister, having, taken this, Bill Graham had played a key role actually in several Canadian foreign policy interventions. He played a key role in Yugoslavia, played a key role in Haiti, played a key role in Afghanistan, played a key role in supposedly our decision not to get involved in Iraq when we really did. But so he was like Forrest Gump, in the sense that he was always at the at these places at all the right times. He was. So the reason why I decided to challenge Bill Graham is I figured I'd probably be the last person to interview him, and I wanted him to actually to know that not all of us are oblivious to what you did. And also I felt that mainly because of Haiti, I felt I owed the victims of Canada's intervention in Haiti that Bill Graham needed to be challenged. Yeah. And I knew Bill Graham personally as well, because I'd mentioned I was a graduate student at the Monk School, and he was a professor, so I knew him personally as well. So to do that, it provided a very uncomfortable atmosphere. And I'm just going to explain, give a little background about Haiti and really what we did before I go into specifically the interview that I did with Bill Graham, which I think is quite illuminating. So in the case of Haiti, the history is Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He was Haiti's first democratically elected leader. He was a Catholic priest who had a strong resonance with the poor people of Haiti.
Yeah, liberation theology.
Yeah, and he had formed this party called the Lavalas Party, and his desire was that poor people should live with just a bare level of dignity, just the bare. He wasn't even asking for that they should live comfortably. Just give them the bare level of dignity, just the bare minimum level of dignity. That's all he wanted. So he wasn't this radicalist socialist, this communist. Just wanted bare level of dignity for the Haitian poor. So he had in the 1990s the election in 1991, he was running to become the president of Haiti, and his opposition candidate was this U.S.-backed, Wall Street-backed candidate, which Noam Chomsky and others discuss in the docu-series when we interview them. And the U.S. kind of just expected this Wall Street-backed candidate to win. They didn't pay much attention to the election. It turns out Aristide wins. During the time in power, he seeks to disband the brutal Haitian military that's committing these horrendous atrocities against Haitians, that's backed by the U.S., trained by the U.S., and he's ousted a few months during his time in power. Then he's finally put back by the United States after he agrees to these neoliberal reforms. These horrendous neoliberal reforms. He's finally put back into power. He's elected a second time. This is the most significant. He's elected a second time in 2000. And during the time the family Lavalas was in power, they had significantly improved the literacy rate in Haiti, significantly improved the literacy rate. They had improved. They had tackled the HIV/AIDS epidemic. There were more schools built during the time that the Lavalas Party was in power than during any other time in Haiti's, independent history. So he was he had also minimally increased the minimum wage in Haiti, and this was something
he basically was like Jacobo Arbenz or Salvador Allende and other Latin American Democrats.
And I mean, he had just increased it by a little bit, but this angered Gilded Activewear, which is the largest blank t-shirt making company in the world, and it's headquartered in it's Montreal, Quebec. And Gilded Activewear, they use Haitian sweatshop laborers to make their t-shirts. So by increasing the minimum wage, these Gilded Activewear, they have to now pay the Haitian sweatshop laborers a couple pennies more. And this angered Gilded Activewear. This angered Canadian business interests as well. But the real reason why Aristide had to go from the West's perspective, is because Aristide was setting a bad example. Aristide, by choosing to just improve the dignity of the Haitian poor, just give them just a bare level of dignity. This was a bad example, because now this could result in a domino effect. And you have other Latin American countries that were previously subservient to the United States, to Canada. Now they're going to want to challenge the United States power. They're going to want to empower their poor, and they're going to want to kick out the foreign corporations. And now, what if Mexico, one of our biggest allies, now what if they start to resist? What will happen then? So Aristide had to go because he was setting a bad example. Also, Aristide was calling for France, which was Haiti's former colonial occupier, while he was president, during his second term. He had calculated that France owed Haiti several billions of dollars because when Haiti became independent, when Haiti was the first Black republic, an agreement was made where Haiti agreed to pay France back for the property which France would lose as a result of Haiti's independence. The property which France would lose is Black Haitians, the slaves, Black Haitian slaves. So we're paying you back for that property. And this had indebted Haiti severely, several decades, millions upon millions of dollars, and so Aristide said, to France, he's the sitting president at this time, we want reparations. We had to unjustly pay this. It severely bankrupted us. It made us impoverished. If you need to give us these billions of dollars, because then we can invest this in our people. We can allow our country to prosper, our poor people to prosper and become educated. So this is what Aristide was saying, and this was a serious deal. And this had angered France. We now know there was a New York Times expose of French diplomats were saying, it was a good thing that we got rid of Aristide, because now this took the pressure off. We don't have to pay reparations anymore. So that was also that was like a final trigger where the Western countries, Canada, United States, France, they kind of came in 2004. And the reason why they had come in was there was a pretext. The pretext was humanitarian intervention, because there were these gangs of rebels which were being backed by the West that were causing they were setting fire to these to these properties in Haiti, and they were gonna come for Aristide, and but these rebels, they were backed by the West. And the pretext was, we're going to go in, we're going to go in, I'm going to control the situation. The Haitian people, they don't like Aristide anymore. They're clearly voicing their opposition to Aristide. So when we interviewed David Pratt, he called, he said that Aristide was a classic example of big man leadership. When we interviewed Bill Graham, he said that Aristide, he did some good things during his first term, but he became a dictator. Power got to his head. Those were the things which.
And the NGOs also did that too. Amnesty International also did a little bit of footsie with that. Human Rights Watch also did that. Alternatives, which was considered a very left-wing, Canadian NGO, Yeah, they were all, depicting Aristide, yes, as once upon a time great socialist, but now he's a dictator, and doing the same with Daniel Ortega. They tried to do. Okay, got a notification that says it's recording?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of my interview with the filmmaker of Truth to the Powerless, Pitasanna Shanmugathas. Did I get it right? Please tell me I got it right this time, right?
Yeah, so Pitasanna Shanmugathas. Yeah.
I'm going to continue to work on this. But anyways, sir, thank you for coming back on the program. And yeah, sorry about that internet problem. Okay, anyways, we were talking about Haiti and how Canadian peacekeeping and the NGO industrial complex was sold. If you can remember where you left off, let's continue with that.
Yeah, so that was the pretense that Haiti, the Aristide was a dictator. This band of rebels, which the West actually supported, they were causing all these atrocities. They were saying Aristide has to go. So it was being framed in the Western media that Aristide was this thug. He's obviously unpopular. He needs to go, and the Haitians themselves are saying he needs to go, so he has to go. That was the narrative, even though it was the West that was behind the scenes. We actually talk about how Canada, Canada and all these Western leaders, they had a summit in Ottawa, planning for Aristide to go and for a UN force to come in and replace Aristide, a UN peacekeeping force to come in and replace Aristide. So once again, there's this peacekeeping narrative, and so this was in 2003. Aristide was ousted in February of 2004. So this was already being planned in the works. And in February 2004, the Canadian forces, Bill Graham talks about how Canada was advantageous in the sense that we're bilingual, English and French. Haiti is there's a French-speaking population, so we were integral in that sense. The United States, Bill Graham was talking about how when we interviewed him, the United States was a little reluctant to get involved. Colin Powell was the one that was really pushing it and was working with Bill Graham, working with Canada, to try and intervene in Haiti. So the Canadian forces go into Haiti. They secure the airport in which Aristide is then taken. Him and his wife are taken, kidnapped against their will, put on an airplane. Canada secured the airport where Aristide was then taken on an airplane. He didn't know where he was going. They dumped him in the Central African Republic. And then began this long UN occupation. Horrendous atrocities were committed. Prior to Aristide being ousted under the Lavalas, there were thousands of elected officials in Haiti. We discussed this in the docu-series. Jean Seville, who's a Haitian dissident, we interviewed him.
Brilliant guy. Yeah, he's also been on the program. Yeah, fantastic guy.
And we interview him, and he talks about this. There were thousands of elected officials. When Aristide was ousted, all these elected officials, they were sacked. And what happened was Canada and the U.S., the West, they appointed people that would be subservient to the interests of the West, and that was largely the situation. And when I was interviewing Bill Graham, why I considered this to be so illuminating, the interview, is because I was challenging Bill Graham on this, and I was talking about, Aristide, he had increased the minimum wage, he had tackled the HIV/AIDS epidemic, he had improved the literacy rate among the Haitian people, the adult literacy rate. He had built schools. He was doing all these good things. So how could you call him a thug and a dictator? And Bill Graham said, well, it's not me who's saying it. It's the Haitian people who are saying it. The Haitian people are saying, that Aristide is a thug and a dictator. I mean, that's not me. I mean, well, I'm saying it, but my opinion is informed by the Haitian people. They're saying it. So that was his narrative. And, I kept pushing him on Haiti, and he kind of got irritated a little bit. And, after the interview was over, he kind of said to me, "Do you know what we did to get him out of the country?" As if we did him a favor, as if we did Aristide a favor. He was just kind of just like exasperated because he just was taken aback that I was grilling him so much on Haiti. Even as he asked me, "Why'd you ask me so many questions on Haiti?" Truth be told, a majority of the questions I asked him was actually on Afghanistan and everything else. But Haiti was just really something that was just irritating him, because I was just I was citing all these sources. I was asking him about what the meeting that they had in Meech Lake. I was asking him about that, and he said, "Oh, I have no clue about that." We got him on the record, saying that he had no clue about it, but he was the foreign affairs minister at the time, so he certainly would have been briefed about it. He said that he never attended the meeting. He certainly would have known about it. Impossible that he would not have. But he just said, "Oh, I didn't attend the meeting. I don't know anything about that." It's obviously a lie. But there was an interesting moment after the interview was done. The cameras are off, and there's this look of pain on his face, and he says to me, "One day I was walking down the street, and these Canadians came up to me and they started heckling me, and they said, 'You're a war criminal. You're a war criminal for what you did in Haiti.'"
Yeah.
He's telling me this, and his face, he has a pained expression on his face. Like, I can tell that he really believes
his own BS.
He believes his own BS, exactly. So the entire premise of this docu-series is speak truth to the powerless. So the first scene of the docu-series is Chomsky's looking into the camera, and he's saying the people in power already know the truth. It's the powerless who don't. So we need to speak truth to the powerless. That's the foundation of our docuseries. So we're interviewing these politicians, and I'm thinking they know what they're saying is BS, but they got to say it because they're part of the establishment. That's my thinking. It really wasn't until I'd interviewed Bill Graham where I was like, wow, like, he genuinely believes everything he's saying. And when I came to that realization, especially when he died, I kind of began reflecting more and more about my interview with him, and I kind of felt sorry for him. I really did.
Yeah.
I felt sorry for him because he genuinely believes everything what he did was a good thing. He does not realize the blood that he has on his hands, and I kind of felt sorry for him. He thought to his dying day that everything that he did was good. I remember when I was interviewing him, when I was asking him all these questions on Haiti, and I actually, even then, I kind of got a glimpse. I'm like, wow, this guy believes everything that he's saying, because he just seems so genuine. And then I finally kind of just say, well, are you aware that, France, they imposed this huge debt on Haiti? And I'm trying to bring the historical causes as to why Haiti's so impoverished. And, I'm telling, are you aware that Aristide, he asked, for France reparations? It's like, and he just tells me, oh, I don't know anything about that. Or, I don't know about that. He was unwilling to look at any alternative, reality that was different to the reality that he had been so accustomed to as being a politician, diplomat. He was unwilling to confront any other reality, and that was a big realization for me, where I was finally like, okay, maybe the politicians in power, maybe it's not that they really know the truth, but what they're saying is BS. That maybe they genuinely believe what they're saying is the truth. Maybe that. And it's something that I still struggle with.
Well, I mean, the idea of peacekeeping, NATO being marketed to Canadians, but Germans, Italians, Spanish, much of the region of Eastern Europe. I think no, I mean, a lot of left-leaning people, they really do believe the BS that NATO is a force for good. Yeah, America is bad, but come on. I mean, like, what's the alternative? You want China? You want, like, Russia, whether it's a capitalist system or a communist system, to be running to be running the show. And then even when you say to people, okay, look, I know that not everything was hunky dory, under the under the USSR, under whatever Eastern European communist system. But have you seen the place now? I mean, there's mass inequality. There's competing far right libertarian groups and politicians. Like, I mean, you really think that like it was right for all of our NGOs and unions to get involved in like the counter-revolution, but they just completely dismiss that, or they really lessen, or they just don't want to take into account that no, we acted as chumps and we carried the water for imperialists. Like do you think that's I'm curious your thoughts on that, because France is often depicted as being a force for good in the world, and I'm curious if in Quebec a lot of like the left-leaning Quebecers and Quebec left nationalists, like do a lot of them and the culture in like Quebec, are they very much influenced by French media and what happens in France, and that's why in Quebec you had many Quebec's corporate media and many supposedly left-wing Quebecers all supported the war in Yugoslavia, the war in Afghanistan, because we're the good guys, and hey, we may be carrying guns, but we're not killing anyone unless they shoot at us. And then of course that gets into the heart of Haiti, where Jacques Chirac, if you go to the French corporate state media, they'll talk all the time about he listened to the protesters in France and did not go into Iraq, and if there's a heaven, he's gonna go there because he did not go into Iraq. But then you look at what Chirac did in Haiti and all the others. So I'm curious your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I mean, when we were interviewing Bill Graham, he even told us, in Montreal, he was talking about one of his liberal colleagues in Montreal. His constituents were Haitian dissidents, and they were telling him, "You got to intervene in Haiti. You got to get Aristide out of there." So Bill Graham was saying, we had pressure from our own constituents that we have to act and we have to intervene in Haiti. So he was, in that sense, the community in Quebec, the Haitian community in Quebec, was certainly did play a role in Canada's decision, certainly pushed Canada to intervene in Haiti. And I mean, we've seen in Quebec, in the case of Iraq, they did play a role in terms of the protest movement. Quebec was opposed to it, and so we couldn't go out there in full force explicitly, but covertly, our generals were. Canadian generals were in Iraq, and so we were able to.
And members of the Quebec bloc must have known this. Like the leader of of the Bloc Québécois must have known all of this. Must have known that. Okay, yeah, we're not. We did not officially join the coalition of the willing, but we are part of the coalition of the willing, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the government in power, they were the ones that were implementing these decisions, and presumably the leaders of the national parties would have been exposed to intelligence to this effect. So certainly they probably would have known that Canada was complicit, was actively involved in the second war in Iraq. In terms of our Canadian generals were participating, U.S. aircraft that was going into traveling through Canadian airspace. They were to bomb Iraq. We allowed the U.S. Jets to go through Canadian airspace en route to Iraq. So we had provided the air support as well. And, we also, Canadian generals also did play a role in coordinating the bombing strikes in Iraq as well. So we also did provide weapons as well, as I'd mentioned. So we provided all this quiet support. And, I even cite a quote from a book by Janice Stein in that episode where we discussed Canada's involvement in Iraq. Janice Stein, who was my professor at the Monk School. She was a leading individual in directing the Monk School for the longest time. She wrote a book on discussing Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, and she mentions she mentions Iraq, and she says Canada was providing all of this quiet support to Iraq, and the Canadian officials in Washington were publicly bragging about this, saying, "Hey, you know, we're actually providing the most support, you know, outside of the explicit coalition of the willing. We're providing the most support to Iraq." So this was a point of bragging on the part of Canadian government officials, you know, that, hey, we're providing all the support, we're your ally, we're America's ally. So you know,
and the Canadian public and the Canadian public, whether it's, you know, Quebec, whether it's in Western Canada or you know, Winnipeg or Nova Scotia, they even some of our best leftists, do they just think, well, yes, that may all be true, but come on, we're a force for good in the world, and we're not the criminals like our friends the U.S. and Britain. Like, is that how they try to like spin and like normalize the unthinkable and like wash like all responsibility of either not actively protesting and so forth? Or
I think that there's a high degree of truth to what you're saying, which is that, you know, to excuse our atrocities, we just compare the atrocities of our neighbors, like the United States. Yes, the United States has committed far more egregious atrocities than Canada ever did. That's true, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be speaking out about Canada's atrocities and namely our support for the atrocities of our neighbors as well, like the United States. You know, we played an integral role, you know, as far as the military-industrial complex goes. You know, Richard Sanders talks about how, you know, weapons which the United States for the past, you know, 50, 60 years, conflicts which the United States has been involved in, they've all used Canadian military components in all of the wars that you can possibly think of for the past 50, 60 years. So in that sense, we're providing a significant support, and we're not supposed to be selling arms to countries that are actively engaged in wars and in horrendous atrocities. So that's something that we're not supposed to be doing under international law, but even under our own domestic laws as well. But yet we continue to do that. So, you know, yeah, you can dismiss and say Canada is not the most egregious. We didn't drop an atomic bomb, but we certainly did provide the materials which were used in the dropping of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Canada did provide the materials, uranium. And so we, you know, so yeah, you can say that, but what about the role that we actually did play in all these horrendous atrocities? What about these small integral, these significant integral roles that we did play, you know, that the media won't talk about? You have to look at that.
It's, you know, it's stunning, and yet, you know, you would think that, you know, that even if somebody does, you know, buy into the BS of like Canada being a force for good in the world, even though they completely know, I mean, nobody in Canada, unlike in Australia and the U.S., even challenges the idea of settler, you know, colonialism in Canada, and yet you would think somebody from, you know, maybe some naive person in the National Post or somebody from, you know, the Globe and Mail, like you would think, you know, it's not that you would think if they just tried to find declassified documents or just looked with their own eyes, you know, on Canada's version of you know, C-SPAN. I think it's CPAC in Canada. Like that. Wow, we really are just a partner in crime to the Anglo-American and Pan-European empire. But a quick follow-up then is you know, something which shocked me when I was rewatching the docu-series in preparation for this. Were you taken by surprise when one of your interview subjects, Colonel News, both of them founded by Paul Jay, who often speaks to to Lawrence Wilkerson, and he often speaks out on NATO, the pivot to Asia, his complicity in the Iraq War when because he worked for Colin Powell, the deceased war criminal. But in the film, he stunningly defended the U.S., Canadian, French, Pan-European ouster of Aristide and the destruction of the frail democracy and the people power movement there. And I was also stunned by Helen Lavadere of the of the NDP. She was an MP, at a riding in Quebec, and she's often, the voice of reason in this film. But following Yves Engler's work and the work of Socialist Action Canada / the NDP Socialist Caucus, I know her history has also been one of being supportive of Canadian imperialism in Venezuela, Syria, and of course the two very thorny topics of both Ukraine and Palestine. So your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, when Lawrence Wilkerson, he was the chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. He's generally very critical about U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he has this very anti-militarist viewpoint, which is a sharp contrast to the views of his colleagues within within the Republican Party. So
exactly.
So
who smell their own BS, as we've been saying about people like Bill Graham and whatnot.
And he talks about this in the docu-series, but his sole education, his sole view as to the United States intervening in Haiti was obtained from the U.S. ambassador to Haiti at the time. He says that the U.S. ambassador to Haiti said that when we intervened in Haiti, we saved Aristide's life, and he constantly references what the U.S. ambassador had told him, and that's his knowledge. He doesn't look to the views of the Haitians that were the victims of this invasion, what they have to say about Aristide having been removed, or even really Aristide himself. I talked to him about. I even quote Aristide and tell him, Aristide said that the United States, Canada, they came in and they kidnapped me, they took me out of the country, and Wilkerson, he kind of just brushes it off and says, Aristide, I wouldn't listen to Aristide if he was standing in front of a church in a podium and saying God was with him. Aristide, he's a thug dictator, blah blah.
But what's shocking about what's shocking about that? Sorry to interrupt, but what's shocking about Wilkerson saying that is you can say that Saddam or Assad or Putin or Gaddafi and Milosevic, I think you can say that they're pretty thuggish. I mean, that's the half truth. I think you can say that about them. You can say that about Joseph Stalin and stuff like that. But that's why it takes great courage to be against what's happening in Ukraine and explaining the full context of that, and marching against the Iraq war, or even marching against NATO's intervention in Afghanistan. But Aristide, that's classic. The U.S., France, and its allies destroyed a democracy. They destroyed a frail democracy, but they really did destroy a democracy and just waged a merciless war on the men, women, and children there. I mean, yes, they did that in Iraq and so forth, but still, I mean, yeah, the Ba'athist Party is is an autocratic state, whereas Aristide, and just like the efforts to oust Maduro, these are Democrats. So that's why I was so shocked by Wilkerson's take on Haiti. Your response?
Yeah, to that. And he doesn't even dispute that Aristide was the democratic leader of Haiti. He doesn't dispute that he was democratically elected. They say that he was a big man, thuggish, but doesn't dispute that he's democratic. I don't think any person we interviewed actually disputed that he was the democratic leader of Haiti. I think everybody recognized that. But he just kind of said, what is the United States to Haiti? That's what Lawrence Wilkerson said, during the interview. What's the United States to Haiti? Haiti's this basket case country. It means nothing to us. We got to keep sending our troops there. It's nothing. It's a basket case. Basically an equivalent of Trump's, shithole, African shit. It's basically the equivalent of that. He didn't go as far as to say that, but he may as well have, because that's what he was saying in effect. But it's just this typical, Jean Seville would say, it's this typical racist white, these white imperialists, and that's the kind of imagery that and that was very obvious throughout episode 6, and especially when we're interviewing all these white old politicians, giving all these racist characterizations of Haiti,
It's stunning, but that goes to show you that Wilkerson has, but that goes to show you that Wilkerson and these NDPers who do support, NATO, the pivot to Asia, and even peacekeeping in, say, Ethiopia, or peacekeeping in, peacekeeping in whichever part of Africa or wherever is the the hot topic. But doesn't that go to show you a deep imperial blind spot of Western Western savior complex, the white person's burden syndrome, and just that we must do something, and they're going to welcome us as heroes, and we just have to make sure that it's an Obama in power or Tony Blair in power, not Stephen Harper or George W. Bush. Those are the bad apples. Is that the kind of, you think, the kind of normalizing of the unthinkable that you think that explains why Wilkerson may be great on Iraq, bad on Haiti, or an NTP MP like Matthew Green, great on Palestine, but when it comes to the pivot to Asia, just recycling, whatever, garbage that's coming out about China.
Yeah, you were mentioning we interviewed Helene Leverdier, who was, at the time when we interviewed her, she was the sitting foreign affairs critic, sitting member of parliament, foreign affairs critic of the NDP, and we had interviewed her at her office in Montreal, and she was somebody who was had a hawkish foreign policy, and we had discussed Israel Palestine, and we asked her, do you support the BDS movement? Does the NDP support the BDS movement? And she just said, we don't support that. We don't believe that's the way. We respect other people, but we don't think that's the way. And that was kind of her answer. And now we've kind of seen in the case of the NDP with Jagmeet Singh, he's a significant shift. And we actually discussed this even in the docu-series. This was a long time coming in the case of just the grassroots NDP, just putting enormous pressure on Jagmeet Singh. There were many activists who would kind of bombard Jagmeet Singh when he was in public places and and challenge him on his policy on Israel Palestine. And finally, when Israel had stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque and evicted Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, it proved to be a breaking point for Jagmeet Singh, and he finally for the first time in Canadian history, the NDP leader in Parliament told Justin Trudeau, you need to halt arms sales to Israel so long as Israel carries out its atrocities. That was a huge thing, but it was years in the making, years and years in the making, and but also the NDP, we see now, that's one positive thing of the NDP. But now we, one negative thing is that they support, the NATO, involvement, support for Ukraine, and exacerbating the conflict. So the NDP does have its roots in militarism as well, and supporting the efforts to remove Nicolas Maduro. So that that hawkishness of the so-called left-wing progressive party is there. There is some improvement, as I mentioned, on the Israel-Palestine issue, but and certainly they would be, many of these. We have a two-party system similar to the United States, liberal, conservative. Their foreign policy is basically the same, more or less, but so, and the NDP in some areas would be better, but it's still the same hawkishness in some areas. Yes, better. Perhaps Israel Palestine, they would be better. I mean, Jagmeet Singh has done a good job of not succumbing to all of this enormous pressure that's being put on him by these Israel lobby groups like CIJA and all these Israel lobby groups. He's stood his ground. Much credit to him, because for years and years he'd been a staunch supporter of Israel. I mean, I remember, I think it was a couple of weeks or even days before the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the eviction of the Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah. Jagmeet Singh was interviewed by a CBC journalist. He was being interviewed about, he was being asked a question about the Israel-Palestine conflict. His answer is about how anti-Semitism is atrocious, and that's his answer. It has nothing to do with the question, but he immediately jumps to that. So, to go from that to now how he's taken a principled position, he's actually put out a formal policy, about where the NDP stands. And so, in some areas the NDP is better than.
So do you think it's just a matter? Sorry to interrupt, but then do you think it's just a matter of we need a very strong anti-imperialist, anti-war movement, which doesn't just campaign like the fashion industry says, okay, for 3 months we're going to be selling striped shirts, and then after that we're going to be selling button-up shirts, and then when it's summertime we're going to be selling t-shirts. Like, do you think that we need that the anti-war or peace movement, however small it is in Canada, needs to learn, okay, yes, it is important that we campaign hard on Palestine, but we do need to realize that NATO, that we can't support NATO, we can't support the pivot to Asia, and if we're going to be against a war for oil in Iran, and we're going to be decrying Western Gulf complicity and the atrocities in Yemen, we also need to be speaking out against the Western Gulf war on Syria.
Yeah, the anti-war movement has to be a very broad-based movement that seeks to incorporate Canadians from all aspects of society. And what we really need is to have these anti-militarists, these peace-minded individuals running for political office and being in a position where they're actually successfully elected. And to do that, you have to appeal to the Canadian constituency, who are largely totally ignorant about all of these issues which you just mentioned. So it's a huge challenge, and especially when you have a media industry in Canada that's so heavily backed. It's multi-million-dollar funded industries, so back to defending Canadian empire. It's no easy task to be able to accomplish this. So it's a struggle.
And that's perfect segue to my second to last question, which is, what has been the response of your film in the left-leaning media / indie media, nonprofit media world of Canada? Has it been positive? Has there been a media blackout and publications that you're surprised who have shunned it? And if it is, and if that answer is negative, what does that tell you about Canada's left and the struggle to mobilize an anti-imperialist peace movement like what exists in the U.S.? And I'll just say that, like, Canada, its anti-settler-colonialism movement much better than the U.S. Whereas the U.S., its anti-imperialist movement, I think is better than Britain or Canada or even France on a good day. So your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our reception, the mainstream media, we've been totally ignored by the mainstream media. My project partner Ryan Ellis, he's been in the film industry for a while. He has a friend, journalist at the CBC. The journalist at the CBC expressed looked at our docuseries and liked it, wrote an article for the CBC. The editorial review board, they refused to publish the article. Didn't say why. No reason was given. But that's just one instance where it was a clear case of censorship of the mainstream media not wanting this to be noticed by the Canadian general public. In terms of left-wing media, Canadian media, it's the reception has been fairly positive. We've the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, as you had mentioned earlier, they did they had a panel discussion with us and with myself and Richard Sanders and Tyler Shipley, and that was very well received. And we've been interviewed. Guerrilla Radio has interviewed us.
Brilliant.
There's been TNT Radio has interviewed us. We have an interview coming up with the World Beyond War, David Swanson as well. So we have the left wing media has been fairly positive and receptive to us. I don't think we've gotten the coverage that we feel that we deserve, given the topics and the issues that our docuseries discusses. I don't feel that we've been given the coverage we deserve from the left-wing media, but we have been given some fair amount of coverage.
Interesting. Well, hopefully, hopefully with more campaigns, and hopefully, with voices like Tyler Shipley, Yves Engler, the Canada Files team, led by the brilliant Aidan Jonah and Arnold August, and International Manifesto Group, and Dimitri Lascaris. Hopefully, with enough pushing from folks like that, it gets the attention that this film deserves, and so one can only hope. And alrighty, well, we end the program, and we haven't been able to do this in recent shows, but we try to end the program with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and done by my hero, the great late James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. So, Pizza, it's your turn to do this. So let's do it before we close, and you get to enjoy the weekend. So here goes. What is your favorite word?
Favorite word? I'd say it's perseverance.
Oh, nice. And what is least favorite words?
Oh, least favorite word. It would have to be like a vulgar, profane word. Like I think my least favorite word is probably like a retarded. I don't, I think
retard. The word retard.
Retard, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I think intellect and insight. I think that's something that really turns me on. Intellect and insight. I think even just funny people as well. Just good general, funny, creative humor is very enlightening when you come across people like that are just naturally, organically funny, and even if you're intellectually funny, like if you're like George Carlin, where you're just like he's intellectually funny, and that's just like a
yes. That's my hero. I know people that can quote Lenin and Karl Marx, but for me, like, my political education really starts with George Carlin, Frank Zappa, John Lennon, and Tupac and stuff like that. So yeah, brilliant. And then, but then, what turns you off? Like, what really turns you off then?
What turns me off is greed. I think greed or deception. I think that really, people who are two-faced. I think that really turns me off. Anything unauthentic. I think that really turns me off.
Cough, cough. Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama. then, yeah. What's your favorite curse words? And it could be in any language.
Favorite curse word. I think it's like damn. I think that's my favorite curse word. Damn. It's like damn. It's like damn. And you can say it in many different ways too.
Funny. Tabitha Wallace, the former co-host of Watching the Hawks, that was her favorite curse word was goddamn. And then what sound or noise do you love? Followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Sound or noise that I love. A baby's laughter. I like that. Baby's laughter.
Nice. And then what sound noise do you dislike then?
Like when you have like those thermos bottles, like when you open the lid, it makes that squeaky noise. It drives me nuts. It just drives me nuts. I remember I'd be sitting in the library when I was a student, and like somebody would just open the bottle. It makes that squeaky sound. I have very sensitive hearing, so I can hear like very well. And I have sharp hearing, so it just cuts through me. I don't say anything, but it just drives me nuts. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I hate that noise.
And then what profession, if you weren't doing the brilliant independent documentary work you do, so what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
I think I'd probably be doing something with refugees, like working with refugees and, in some, like as a caseworker or something, working with refugees. And because I have a very strong sympathy with the refugee community. So I'd probably do something like that.
Oh, brilliant. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Being a chairperson for Barrick Gold. I don't want that.
Exactly, because you think how do you sleep at night, and of course it's like
I couldn't. The blood on my hands would be too much. No amount of money can dry up the blood on my hands, so I wouldn't want to do
it. Special place in hell for greedy capitalist warmongers and whatnot. And then final question: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the vision of the afterlife you believe in vision, or even if you don't believe, but you're proven wrong that there is an afterlife, what would you like to hear God or whomever as you arrive there?
Pita, even you surprised me, but good job. Come on in. We got Sam Cooke playing. We got James Brown playing. Come on in, man. We got a concert going on.
Well, with this film, you're definitely going to get with this film in real life and in the afterlife, you're definitely going to get it. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 and yet another All Things Canada episode with indie documentary filmmaker Pitasanna Shanmugathas. Please tell me I got it right. Did I get it right this time?
Yeah, you got to keep trying, but
Or Petsa. We were joined on on this brilliant edition of 1+1 with the indie documentary filmmaker Petsa, whose superb docu-series, 6-part docu-series, Truth to the Powerless, on the historical past and current affairs currently on Canada's regressive imperial role in the world, is available to watch for free now. I'll make sure to put the links to that and the other topics that we discussed in there. Sir, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for reaching out so that we can do this interview. It was a real honor.
Thank you so much for having me, Youri. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you. I'm a huge, a long-time watcher of your program and know your work very well. So it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And we hope to have you as a regular.